Thank you all for coming to our event this morning with Landis Communities. We're delighted to have you join us, and apologies for the slightly late start. I was getting a phone call from somebody who couldn't find the link. So just doing double duty this morning. We're really excited to be able to have everybody together, even if it's not quite in the same way that we're used to gathering for these wonderful Landis community breakfasts. And so I'm gonna introduce Larry Gingrich from Landis Communities to welcome you all to this breakfast. And then we'll get started with Conrad very shortly thereafter. Larry was born in Aspen, Colorado, where his parents were doing voluntary service, and spent a lot of his growing up years in Michigan in the Upper Peninsula. He went to high school in Northern Indiana and college in Kansas and Virginia, and moved to Lancaster in 1996. So I think probably qualifies now as a native Lancastrian. There's always a, not yet, okay. He is married to Kendra, and they have 2 boys and 2 cats, and live in East Petersburg. He has worked at Eastern Mennonite University, at 10,000 Villages as the media coordinator, at Mennonite Central Committee's communication department as a media coordinator. And then he was at Atlantis Communities, and he has served as the Director of Organizational Communications and Church Relations since 2011. He's a wonderful contact and partner at Atlantis Communities. We're delighted that they are the platinum sponsor for Parish Resource Center's workshop and event scheduled this year again. And so I'll turn it over to you, Larry. We're having some hard times hearing you, I think.
Does that help? Okay. Well, I'm glad to be here with you today. Certainly we have, over the years, have tried to host clergy breakfast with one goal in mind, and that is to provide some resources to clergy and lay leaders as they walk with folks in their congregation who are aging. We've had a variety of speakers over the years, and after needing to cancel last year, we felt strongly that we wanted to do something this year. And as we were thinking about that, we were talking with Kate and the partnership that we've developed, and it seemed to just really work well to do this. Landis Communities, for those of you who don't know, we provide aging services for folks in Lancaster and the surrounding area, and increasingly are working at providing those services in homes where people live and in places other than the traditional retirement home settings. Some of our most current work is a partnership with the Quakers Friends Life Care, providing what we call continuing care at home. And then also we are getting ready to begin work in downtown Lancaster on some apartments that will be for folks age 55 and over, and will be designed for folks in the bottom and the middle parts of the income range. Right now, our work takes us from low-income housing tax credit for folks with less than half the median income, all the way through Landis Homes, which is where we got our beginning, which is your more traditional continuing care retirement community. We're really glad to partner with the Parish Resource Center and with Conrad in bringing this to you. It does continue our desire to be a resource to congregations in the area. Certainly we can provide a lot of background and sharing, particularly as it relates to how congregations may want to walk with folks with memory loss, how congregations might want to do education around opportunities for aging. And certainly I or others are available to share with you or with small groups or with congregations along the way. And we do that either virtually or in person as the situation warrants. And Kate will be dropping into the chat and posting some contact information for me. Certainly we encourage you to check out our website at landiscommunities.org. And with that, I'll turn it back to Kate and she can introduce Conrad. And again, welcome.
Thank you, Larry. I will also include Larry's contact information when we send out a recording of this event after the sometime early next week. So you'll also have it there. We're delighted to have Conrad Kanagy join us this morning. He is a professor of sociology at Elizabethtown College and has served in ministry for 20 years. 4 years ago, he was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. This diagnosis was a major impetus for change in his life, calling, and ministry. In May 2020, he created a podcast entitled A Church Dismantled, A Kingdom Restored, which draws on his personal life, ministry research, teaching experience, and more. Conrad anticipates a sabbatical this fall to further develop a current podcast, as well as to create a new one entitled Aging at Midlife, Meaning, Faith, and Renewal. And if you haven't had a chance, we included a number of his podcasts on the event listing page, and I'd really encourage you to listen to them. He does a wonderful job at talking about many topics that I think will be really relevant to everybody who's attending today. Just a housekeeping note or two. If you have a question during Conrad's talk, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, and he will be happy to respond. I think we'll also have a Q&A time at the end or sort of midway as well. We will be breaking you into small breakout rooms at another point in the presentation as well. So just so you're not surprised by that. And then if you also want to chat questions to me, I'm happy to also ask Conrad. So multiple ways to interact this morning. And if you have any questions, feel free to chat me as well. So thank you so much for coming this morning, and I will turn it over to you, Conrad.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate, and the Parish Resource Center, and Larry and Landis Communities. I'm really honored to be part of this time today. And I want to begin by saying that I don't come with answers. I come with lots of questions. And after writing for the last year, some folks think that I must have answers, but I don't have the answers. But I keep asking lots of questions. And one of the things that I love about a venue like this one is that it's an opportunity for us to have what I like to call a learning lab, where we're really learning from each other, because we're all on this, as I say, this Isaiah 40 excavation project, lowering mountains, raising valleys, making rough places plain and crooked places straight. I do say, I'll say right up front, I tremor at times, and so you may or may not experience that. As I say, what's on the inside comes out on the outside these days, and it's part of also the journey that I'm on. What I'd like to do is pull up a PowerPoint, and as I was preparing this for today, I realized in some ways how scattered the last year has been for me, and how trying to pull together this last year of writing it's been a zigzag experience for me. Can you see this, Kate, okay? If I want to get it on slideshow. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay. This last year has been really a kind of zigzag experience for me, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think this morning in some ways will be the same way, and I think that's so much the way our lives are, and I hope that you, wherever you're at this morning, feel comfortable and make yourselves comfortable and settle in for a time of experiencing together what God might be up to, as I say in the podcast, in the world, in the church, in your life, in my life. I'm sitting in my office at the college overlooking the tree that I've been watching for 25 years, and it's an oak tree that's greening, and it's just beautiful this morning, so welcome. I grew up in Big Valley, Pennsylvania, and the older I get, the more I realize how that valley shaped me for good and perhaps for ill. It's become part of my podcast journey over the last year. I grew up at Locust Grove Mennonite Church, which is in the Conservative Conference. My grandfather, Erie Reno, was longtime bishop. He was the first pastor not named by lot. He did some pretty radical things for his day. He did away with the council meetings in the 1950s. He did away with the Common Cup. He welcomed vets back into the church after Vietnam. And the older he got, the more he experienced the love of God. And I have often prayed that that would be my experience as I aged as well. I'm married to Heidi. Heidi Mitchell grew up in, Heidi, she was a Brenneman, Her last name was Mitchell, but her mother was a Brenneman. Her father was a physician. Her grandfather was a longtime Doc Brenneman physician in Big Valley. She grew up at Maple Grove Mennonite Church, which was then in Allegheny Conference. And she is a graduate of Eastern Mennonite and the University of Maryland at Baltimore with a master's in clinical social work. I'm a graduate of Wheaton College with a BA in sociology anthropology, and then did my MS and PhD work in rural sociology at Penn State. We have one child, Jacob, and Jacob is married to Sarah, and we have a 20-month-old grandson. I've been teaching at Elizabethtown College since 1993, so I'm finishing my 28th year. Heidi and I have been serving at Elizabethtown Mennonite Church for 15 years of the last 20. We had a 5-year break in between. They called us back, and we are retiring, or I'm retiring at the end of this year. I also continue to do some consultancy work for Lancaster Mennonite Conference. Where are we going this morning? This is my rough sketch of where we're going. As I tell my students when they're writing a paper, they're in charge of the journey, at least in charge of facilitating the journey. Where are we going? How are we going to get there? And you're entering this morning with me an experience that I've been having for the last year, and I realize that many folks who misunderstand my journey haven't had the opportunity to be with me on it. And so part of what I'm trying to do this morning is share part of that journey with you. It'll include my personal journey of what I call dismantling. It'll include the church story of dismantling. I've been calling this podcast The Church Dismantled, which came out of my research of Mennonite Church USA 15 years ago, when I remember exactly where I was when I had this question: what if the Holy Spirit is dismantling the church so that we get back to the mission of God? And the question that immediately followed for me was, then what is our responsibility as leaders as part of that dismantling? That question lay dormant for me until last May when COVID hit. And I'll talk a little bit more about that this morning. What do I hope are the outcomes for this morning? One, that we all consider what are the lessons that we're learning from one another about lives that are dismantled. And I'll talk more about what that means. What are the lessons for a church that is being dismantled? And how do we care for the dismantled ones in the world and the church? Because that's our calling. Ultimately, that's what Jesus left us with. And if we are being dismantled, I think in so many ways, it's so that we can finally empathize with, move to the margins with those who Jesus always hung out with himself. I'll have some time for large group discussion. I actually love those times because we are all, as I like to say, sociologists. We all have hypotheses about the world. And I'm as interested in hearing yours as I am in sharing my own, or even more so. When I was a kid, I read a book by Judson, I can't remember his last name right now. It was a little tiny book I picked up somewhere. And he was Pentecostal, and I didn't even know what that meant as a little Mennonite kid in Belleville. But he took the passage from Isaiah 40, and it captured my imagination. And though I was a terribly tormented kid at that time of my life by obsessive compulsive disorder, and would remain so, frankly, through much of my life, adult life, religiously preoccupied with God's damnation and in a lot of terror much of my life, this passage stood out to me because he took this passage and he created it in such an imaginative way, or he talked about it in such an imaginative way that it caught my attention as a kid. That God is inviting us into this journey, into the wilderness, to prepare the way for the Lord, to make straight in the desert a highway for our God, where every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain and hill be made low, the uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. And I think what captured my attention, in spite of the terror that I lived in most of the time, was this little window that I saw of opportunity for us to be invited into the Creator's work, the creative work of the Creator, and that there was some role for me to play in that. And of course, this I would later learn was also the passage that in so many ways drove Martin Luther King Jr. And his justice journey to bring justice to the injustice that he and so many of his community have experienced. And so I just want to keep this passage in front of us because I think it is a passage for a dismantled church. I have received, as you might imagine, sufficient feedback and questions about what do I mean by a church dismantled. I've received them in my own congregation. Part of the challenge for me this past year is that I'm a pastor in a local congregation with what I have come to believe is also a prophetic word. And there is, for those of you who are pastors, you know the tension of that, of the pastoral ministry and the prophetic ministry. And I think most of us resist the idea that the church could be dismantled, that God would somehow be taking it apart. But when we look back at the Old Testament, it was so clear that God was dismantling God's people because in so many ways they have been unfaithful. And so I don't think renewal ever comes until we accept the dismantling. I don't think renewal ever comes until we receive the dismantling. But Jesus told us that. I mean, he told us that unless the seed dies, there is no resurrection. And so when I heard this question 15 years ago, it actually sounded like good news to me, because as I was wrestling with what many perceived as the bad news for the church 15 years ago, declining memberships, the aging of the church, our youth fleeing the church, the hope I had was in this question, which became a rhetorical question for me. What if God is dismantling the church? That's my hope then, that it's not just falling apart, but the Spirit of God is actually up to an excavation project here. And then I go back again to Isaiah 40. I get to be part of that excavation project. You get to be part of that excavation project. And at the end of that time, at the end of that project, we have the new heaven and the new earth, and justice reigns. So what I've done today is I'm going to move you through. I probably published 225 podcast episodes in the last year. And I've woven some of them together today. So if you've heard some of this material, forgive me. It's excerpts of a narrative that tries to hold together the story. And I have some PowerPoint slides to go with it. So it was the middle of last May when we were in the middle of the COVID crisis, and I kept hearing leaders in our community saying, we've got to reopen the church, reopen the church, reopen the church. And I had this visceral reaction, and I usually write a weekly email to the congregation, and I just call it my weekly email. And this one was called Why the Church Cannot Be Reopened. And I went on to describe that the church is not like local retail stores. It's not like restaurants, gyms, and so on. There's an eschatological thing going on here. God's up to something here, and the church was never closed. Just because we shut our doors doesn't mean we have the power, the authority, are authorized to close the church. We can't do that. The church is much greater than that, deeper than that, eternal. And I put it on Facebook, which I never do. I haven't used Facebook in years, but it took off. And at that point, I knew nothing about podcasting, but decided I would try it. And so I worked at that, and that became the podcast. And the podcast then just began to evolve. And for me, it became the intersection and integration of a variety of areas of my life, professional, personal, spiritual, emotional, in our marriage, in my other relationships, areas of my life that in so many ways I walked through fairly seamlessly, but I wasn't always the same person in all of them. We, as sociologists, we talk about social roles, and we are so good at picking up one role at church and taking a different role at home and taking a different role into the university and so on. And this podcast was a forum that brought together for me 3 decades of teaching sociology, 35 years of sociological research, my consulting work in the church, our ministry at church, my longtime struggle with OCD that tormented me, and dealing with perhaps finally what it meant to grow up in Big Valley. And I'll just say this, if you know anything about Belleville, you know that anyone who's Mennonite there was Amish. This afternoon, I'm interviewing Richard Kaufman for my Live at 3:45 live podcast. And Richard and I are third cousins. And I think everyone in the valley is at least a third cousin, if not less, more than that. So it's a small place, and we all came from the old order culture. And it is the most divisive old order culture or group settlement probably in the country, where there are 3 colors of buggies. And within those 3 different affiliations, there are even other different divisions. And so for whatever reason, there is this kind of divisiveness, and I would say oppressiveness. As much as I love the valley, as much as I say I first heard God most clearly in the valley, there is still this piece that I have to acknowledge that's part of my biography and that has shaped me. And then finally, my diagnosis, 4 years of Parkinson's disease. Almost a year later, it'll be May next month, I'm being asked the question, what are you up to, Conrad? Why are you doing this? I was recently invited to speak, and I shared, and they started out with a qualifying question, essentially asking, are you still a Christian? It wasn't quite that blatant, but I explained to them what I was up to, and I haven't heard back from them. My response to what I'm up to has simply been something along the lines of, it's the deconstruction or the tearing down. It's the taking apart of the socially constructed elements of the church that have been or always were irrelevant to the central message of the gospel. It's taking apart the ways of doing church that have lost their meaning for our children. It's the ways of interpreting scripture that were cultural and period bound. It's alliances with principalities and powers that have terribly compromised the message of Jesus, which we particularly have seen over the last 4 years. It's the removing tired committees that spend too much time figuring out who's going to clean the church and the carpet and who's going to get on with the mission of God. And I like to say that our children are not fleeing the church so much because they're pagan, as because in fact they might be seeing something that the rest of us aren't seeing, and that we need to ask them what they're seeing. We need to be curious about their stories and what they're experiencing, because the taken for granted reality gets into us, and it's a sociological concept that I use all the time, but we come to recognize our world and take it for granted, and we don't know there's another world. And so what are they seeing as they grow up in that world that we completely miss because we've been so well socialized into that world? And so again, for me, the Dismantling Project is deeply grounded and rooted in Isaiah 40. It's the excavation project that God intended for us to be up to all along. I did a little podcast episodes called Saved by Sociology, sort of, because someone asked me recently, not critically so much, but I think curiously, it seems like sociology has really gotten into you, like it's absorbed within you. And I said, it's what saved me. It was in me as a kid, because I didn't quite believe what I heard as a kid. As conforming as I was, I grew up pretty much doing whatever anyone told me to do. I didn't quite believe it. And it was the quote up here on the right with the kid looking through the blind is what a Sunday school teacher told me in about 8th grade. And I remember the room where we were, and she said to me, you know, children, the world is a very dark place. It's very dangerous out there, but it's safe here in the church. And I remember my immediate thought as like a 12-year-old, 13-year-old was, Sunday school teacher, the devil's as much in here as he is out there. Like we are not immune from darkness just because we're in the walls of this church or we're in this community. And so somewhere along the line, I didn't buy it. Somewhere along the line, I didn't buy the formula that I was given. And I love Peter Berger, who's my favorite sociologist. He's written The Sacred Canopy, which is the best thesis on religion as far as I'm concerned from a sociological perspective. But he has this quote, the wisdom of sociology is that things are not as they seem. And I think that's what I understood growing up as a kid, that somehow things were not as they appeared to be. I saw things happening around me that didn't make sense to me given the theology that I was told or given the narrative that I was told. There's also another favorite quote of mine from sociology is called the Thomas Theorem. And it's simply this: situations defined as real are real in their consequences. So if we define the world as dark, we are going to experience the world as dark. And so I grew up in a world that, as we all do, we're all dropped into a cultural map. I was not unique. You dropped into cultural map. I was dropped into cultural map. And we try to figure our way through that map. And sometimes the formulas make sense. And sometimes the formulas don't make sense. We know that 10 to 15% of Amish youth leave their Amish community. And as one of my students said last week, it must be because the formula doesn't make sense to them. And I love that. I love that thought that there are some, for some of us, there is a different reality that we see. And I think that is often a prophetic reality. I think God's Spirit is at work to continually unsettle the taken for granted reality that we live in. Because if we don't, like Lewis says, you can never remain stagnant in your life with God. You're either moving forward or you're moving backward. There's a second idea that I have. The second idea about dismantling that I talk about is not just the taking apart of that which is irrelevant, but for me, it's also taking off the covers, taking off the mantle that we have placed upon the truth. And so I have a little episode talking about what sociologists do and don't do, see and don't see. And essentially, in many ways, we're simply up to saying to other people, which gets us in trouble all the time, that emperor has no clothes on. Like he's or she's as naked as a jaybird. There's nothing on them. And that's not a message that's very popular because we've all been able to convince ourselves over the generations that there really is clothing on the emperor. And so for me, dismantling the church also means we've got to take off the stuff that's keeping us from seeing the truth. And I would say seeing the truth about Jesus. When I talk about Jesus in my classroom, and one of the things that's become unloosed in me over the last year is that I talk about Jesus more than I ever did before in my classroom. And my students have no problem with it because the Jesus I talk about is not a Jesus most of them have ever heard before because we've so well covered up that Jesus. And so part of this calling that I think we're up to as followers of the language I've been using these days in my classroom is I am a follower of the mystic and prophet from Nazareth. I've stopped saying I'm a Christian or evangelical in the classroom because it's got too much baggage with it. It's been too mantled by too much that I can't identify with. And so over the past century, and I think because the church has felt so threatened, I think in some ways the church, I've said a lot this past year that I'm more comfortable in the cultural landscape of the academy than I am of the church. And in part, I think it's because the church is even more insecure than the academy is. That we feel, I think over the last 100 years, with the onset of modernity, and by modernity, I mean rational ways of doing things. I don't mean education. I mean what Max Weber talked about as formal rationality. That is the construction of rational ways of doing things. And ultimately, his language for that was bureaucracies. And he talked about the iron cage of rationality, that we would get to this place he was afraid, where in the modern world, we would lose our ability to be imaginative, to be creative, to make change, and we would be locked in an iron cage. And he said the only two solutions to that unlocking and getting out of that cage is the rise of charismatic leaders. And he didn't mean in a religious sense, but he meant leaders, people who see the world differently and are willing and have the courage to share it. And two, the recovery of what he called old ideals. And I love that language, the charismatic prophet and the old ideals, because I think in so many ways they go together. And so for me, the dismantling is unlocking that iron cage and going back and recovering what it really means to be a follower of Jesus. And I'm not claiming at all to be the first one to do that. There are lots of us struggling with that and working at that. But for me, it's been part of this particular journey of the last few years. And so I think over the last 100 years, the church has tried at least three things to deal with modernity, but they've all mantled the truth. The first one was we hunkered down, and we were doing that before the 19th century or the 20th century, but in some ways in the early part of the 20th century, in a new way, we recommitted to hunkering down anew, to becoming even plainer, even more withdrawn, even more separate from the world. It's the message I heard from my Sunday school teacher. That has not kept our youth in the church, and it has not helped us with the gospel message. A second thing we did was in the middle of the century, like many evangelicals, we joined revival meetings. And if you listen to the podcast at all, you know that I take to task, in some ways tongue in cheek, but in some ways not so much, George Brunk II, because George Brunk II came to Big Valley, and he had revival services at least once or more than once, but they were traumatic moments for me. And I think the church in that period, in the middle of the 20th century, was so fearful of modernity. And in some ways I empathize with George, because I recognize that probably it was his own way of critiquing modernity, but it was a reaction out of fear and judgment of the world that God so loved and so loves still. And for me as a kid, it only added mantling to the truth. It only covered up more of the truth about who Jesus was that I was already struggling with. And it, along with the culture in which I grew up, and also with my DNA, or who knows, whatever it is, that where our mental health challenges come from, contributed to a lifelong struggle with OCD, terror of God, damnation. Couldn't go to sleep as a kid at night until my mom prayed with me. Struggled through college, struggled through most of my adult life. I've often said it's a miracle of God's grace that I'm still a follower of Jesus, because I was convinced that the good news was not really good news. And so I like to say that the dismantling of the church almost dismantled my soul. And then when I was at Wheaton College, I realized the church was trying. I was at Wheaton in the early 1980s. And I realized the church was trying a third alternative to address the world, and that was the moral majority. And when you look at the data on the Mennonite church, you see that we joined them. Mennonite participation in politics goes up dramatically between 1982 and 1980 and 2006. And so as a church, we jumped headlong or head first into this response of the evangelical church to go into war against the culture. And we have been doing that for 45 years. And I think, at least I believe, it has been a selling of our soul, as I say, to the devil. We've abandoned the Jesus of the Gospels. I don't know if in the evangelical church that can be recovered. I don't know what that would look like these days. And again, we've covered up the gospel. As I face my students in the classroom these days, students who are in deep pain, who jokingly, but not really jokingly, respond to the question of how are you doing with the response of I'm dead. And that was before COVID. And when I ask them why, they say, because we've grown up in a world that's full of anxiety. We are pessimistic about the future, about climate change, about the polarization in the culture. They grew up just after 9/11, and they didn't experience it, but they grew up in the shadow of that. The rhetoric around race and ethnicity and racial injustice, they are very pessimistic about the world they're growing up in. And they struggle more than ever with anxiety and depression. They claim gender identities that the church often doesn't recognize. And I've said this in a podcast this week, I will not separate myself from them, that these three responses of the church over the last century, I can't endorse. I can't separate myself from these students in my classroom. I will not preach hellfire and brimstone to them, and I will not militarize against them or their culture. Because over the last 100 years, we've had this amazing opportunity to preach Jesus and who Jesus really is in the Gospels. And I think too often, and I say myself, have missed that opportunity. And so in my podcast this week, I said simply, I will stay with my students who so much need the good news that over the past year I finally found. And if it took me, a pastor, that many decades to find it, why shouldn't I be patient with them? For if the good news is not good news for them, it's not good news for me either. On February 14, 2017, I heard the words from a physician at Penn Medical Center in Philadelphia say to me, as she did a physical exam of my tremors that had been going on for a year, she said, "I don't think there's an alternative diagnosis to Parkinson's disease." That was Valentine's Day 2017. She didn't offer me any hope, any direction, any path forward. Heidi and I simply left in distress, having no idea what this meant. A visit, I was 52 at the time. A visit a couple of months later to the same specialist confirmed the same diagnosis, spoken with the same negative construction of the sentence, as if to bypass the stark reality that I was facing. And again, she said, "I don't think there's an alternative to Parkinson's disease." And she offered me no way forward. I spoke to my family doc about it, and he said, "Boy, you sure don't want to have this disease. It's all encompassing." And it was if I had some choice in the matter, of course, which I did not. So one doc spoke in terms of reality, of a reality denied, mantled the reality. Another confronted the reality, but offered no hope. And so it was by the grace of God that Heidi and I would have a sabbatical planned. I had become extremely depressed in the summer of 2016. Depression was not new to me, but the darkness I experienced in the summer of 2016 was new to me. I've been in therapy enough to know that I needed to do something about it. And so I turned to someone who was not helpful at all. And so I kept struggling with it. But I said to Heidi when we took our vacation that summer, I've got to take a sabbatical. I can't go on the way that I'm going on. Looking back now, I realized that it was the onset of Parkinson's disease, because as you lose dopamine, you lose serotonin. Depression, anxiety are much part of that. And so we went on a sabbatical, and we didn't tell the church about the diagnosis. We just got out of town, and it was a real gift for us. We took a retreat, and there were 3 lessons I learned on that retreat that I want to talk on that trip west that I want to talk about. We went to Colorado, did a ministry retreat for a week that was wonderful, and then went to the Oregon coast. The first one was we went to the Chihuly Museum. Dale Chihuly, some of you have probably been to this museum, was a glass blower who did this amazingly outstanding work. I mean, this is some of his work in the museum, and it doesn't even begin to express what you see when you go there. But while I was there, I noticed this plaque on the left-hand side here, and it said this: "After losing sight in his left eye and dislocating his shoulder, Chihuly relinquished the gaffer position and began drawing as a way to communicate his vision and his designs to his team. The drawings evolved beyond the communication tool, to become an important part of his expression. He would later conclude, drawing really helps me to think about things. I'm able to draw and work with a lot of color that inspires me." This was my first hint that this all-encompassing disease that I had might just be an opening to new creativity, to new joy, to new ways of revealing to others what was inside of me. For it was in giving up the gaffer position that Chihuly's students could be empowered in new ways to do what he had been doing for decades. It was in picking up the paintbrush that Chihuly could reveal the vision that was in his heart and mind all along, but that others couldn't see. All they could see was the glass as it came out. But the glass came from somewhere. The vision of the glass came from a heart and mind that was deeply creative. And so people could only see the grandeur of the outcome, but they couldn't see into the heart and soul of the artist. And now they could. They could see what was in his mind and what was in his heart. And these drawings themselves now sell for thousands of dollars. The reality is that Dale Chihuly's disability was simply the next step in his maturation as an artist and a mentor. I found that tremendously encouraging. We then visited the Olympic National Forest. And if you've been there, you know this is an incredible temperate rainforest, tropical forest. Everything is green. But what I walked away from all of that grandeur with was this tree. this crooked tree, because as we hiked the trail and took photos of majestic and gigantic trees that had been there for centuries, it was this crooked tree of no particular majesty except that it had fallen partway across the trail, but had continued to grow. Bent it was, but upward. And it was that tree of all the trees that caught my attention, for against the odds, it persevered. It was not beautiful for its perfection, but beautiful for its persistence and its resilience. Its persistence to live, to breathe, to experience joy, and to accept its bentness as part of who it was in that sacred forest. That it also, in its bentness and crookedness, had a place, had a space in that forest. And you couldn't help but notice this tree because it was the one tree that you had to walk under. It was almost as if this crooked tree was saying to us, see me, you can't get by without noticing that I'm here. It demanded our attention more than the others. And I began again to have this vision. Perhaps I would be more present in my own life than ever before because of this new disability. Perhaps the reality of my own crookedness and the acceptedness of my crookedness and brokenness, that I could no longer deny, that what was tremoring on the inside now tremors on the outside. Maybe that reality, maybe accepting that reality could make me more useful than I'd ever been before. Maybe my persistence and resilience and perseverance by God's grace would reveal more of God's glory and faithfulness in my life than ever before. The final lesson I walked away with at the end of that trip was a book by Mark Buchanan on Sabbath rest. And for the life of me, I spent too much time this week trying to find this quote. This is not a direct quote, but it's a paraphrase of what I did read in that book, I promise you. And it's a terrific book. I read it while we were on sabbatical, and Sabbath rest continues to speak to me. But he says something like this: just because we experience a disability doesn't mean that we can't find our own way. We can't find our way home. It just might be that we need to do so leaning on the shoulder of a friend. And in that moment, I realized I had broken my hip in 2013. I fell off the roof the Saturday before I was to preach a sermon on turning 50 and how much I was dreading turning 50. I fell off the roof Saturday and never preached that sermon and haven't looked back at it since. I don't even know what I said. But the recovery from that hip fracture was so difficult and so challenging for Heidi and I together that I said to the Lord, don't ever allow me to have a chronic disease. I don't think we can handle a chronic illness if something happens to me. And then something happened to me. But what I realized as I read Buchanan, and what I realized as I was on that trip with Heidi, was that she was going to be the shoulder that was going to get me through. And I can't say enough over the last 4 years of how that has been true. The dynamic has shifted in our relationship in such a way that she is my greatest advocate. She always was, but in a different kind of way. She watches out for me. She carries emotional things for me that I'm not able to carry these days because of the thinness of my emotional capacity in the midst of stress, which is why I'm retiring from the church at the end of the year. And she defends. When we were discerning whether to leave the church last year, she simply said, I see you in ways that other people don't see you, and you have no choice. You must step down. This has become too stressful for you. And so it really has, it's been this marvelous shift for us that I am so grateful for, and reminds me that had I not experienced this, we in our own marriage would not have experienced some of the transformation that we've experienced. And I am more grateful for Heidi, more grateful for her shoulder to lean on than I ever have been in my life. One of the passages that's become so important to me in this time also is this one in 2 Corinthians 4, where Paul, the older he gets, the more he realizes that it's only in our brokenness that Jesus is ever revealed to us. It's only as we are uncovered, as we are unmasked, as we are unmantled, that the life of Jesus is revealed in our body. And I think what I've struggled with over the last year, and I'm going off script a little bit, and I'm trying to watch the time, I've struggled over the last year with my sense that this year of COVID was an opportunity for the church to finally address its dismantling, the need for its dismantling, the recognition that we had covered stuff up, that we had covered up the gospel truth, that we had created structures that were no longer useful. It was a time to reset. And I think part of my greatest grief these days is when I look around and realize how much I think we failed in that opportunity, that we have resisted at recognizing how broken we are, how dismantled we already are, that in some ways the work I'm doing is simply pointing out the truth, I think, rather than doing the dismantling myself. In fact, I don't think I have the power to dismantle the Church of Christ. And so I think part of my grief these days is that I'm not sure we've done the work that we had the opportunity to do. We just wanted, we ended up fighting over masks. And I'm talking about the church too. I'm talking about many congregations. We ended up fighting over masks. We ended up dividing politically. And we missed the opportunity to move in, I think, and understand the power of brokenness. After I was preaching one Sunday, somebody approached me and from the congregation, and we were disassembled at that point, but there were still a few people in the congregation doing the ITS work, and one of them approached me and said that they were concerned about my podcast, that they felt like I was not getting enough accountability for it, if I was saying things that maybe I shouldn't be saying. And I was tired. I had just preached, and I kind of hem-hawed behind my mask, and I probably didn't respond as graciously as I could have. But as I walked away, I wished the answer came to me that I wished I had given. And that answer combines the titles of these two old hymns that I've come to love again in my life. I wish I had said something like this, and I say it often now: just as I am, this is my story, this is my song. You may not agree with my story, and you may not agree with my song. You may not appreciate the story and song that I have, but this is my story, and this is my song. And I will sing it and tell it forever in the presence of the one who receives me just as I am, and my story just as it is. I go on to say, and this again is part of a podcast episode, that we grow up mantling the truth about who we are, or it is mantled. We grow up masking the truth. The social controls, Peter Berger says, that allow us to mask the truth are mostly from those in our family and friends. They have the greatest control over us. And so we learn not to tell the truth very early on. The truth gets us in trouble. And then we grow up as followers of Jesus, also recognizing that speaking the truth will get us in trouble. And so we carry around within all of us, I think for many of us, this burden of darkness, shame, that somehow we're flawed. And I'll say more about that in a moment. We grow up hearing the message, don't let others see you as you are. Don't. And there are many good reasons for telling our children don't, but the problem is that too many of the don'ts are driven by shame and fear of being stigmatized. And the end result is that as children, we learn to shut down and shut up. And when we do, we stop singing our song and we stop telling our story. And one of the things that has amazed me over the last year is how many people I hear from this podcast, probably this weekend will reach 40,000 episode downloads. And I say that humbly because I don't feel like it. I feel like my detractors may disagree, but I feel like last May I had as much of a Pentecostal experience as I've ever had. And so what has amazed me is how much this message resonates with people, that it's not just my story, it's the story of so many of us, that we learn to shut up and not sing our song, not tell our story, which means then we stop telling the story of the gospel. And I realized as I've been more open with my students about my story of Jesus, it wasn't Jesus I was ashamed of. It was me I was ashamed of. I was ashamed to tell the story of Jesus, not because I was ashamed of Jesus, as much as because I was ashamed of myself. And as I have learned to accept that I am broken, that I am flawed, that I do tremor, that I am crooked, as I've learned that God receives me in new ways, as I've learned in new ways that that's exactly the way God receives me, I've also been much more open to tell the fullness of my story about who I am, including what Jesus means to me. I love what Anne Lamont says when she says, I'm so Jesus-y. And I would say that's probably where I'm at this point in my life. I wish in many ways I had broken through this wall, this mantling earlier in my life. I'm sure I did damage to other people. I did damage to myself. I wish in some ways that it had not required a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease to remind me that I have a horizon that's ahead of me, that I don't know where it's at, but it's very clearly ahead of me now. I wish I had learned to accept and be an authentic and honest human being earlier than now. I wish I would have cared less about what saints and sinners, and we're all a mix anyway, had thought about what I believe about my story and my song. But by God's grace, I think he has broken through for me at this season of my life, and I'm ever grateful for that. If it's taken the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease to release the story, release my song, then thanks be to God, because I've never felt more free in my life. About 1 year into my diagnosis, and that first year I was raging and screaming and crying. I'd go to the gym and I'd just break out into tears over this diagnosis. But about a year later, I went to Rocksteady Boxing, which is a program for, this is our son Jacob, but it's a program some of you are familiar with, run by Sue Ludwig in Lancaster for those of us with Parkinson's. And I'm sad to say we lost 13 members during COVID in the last year. But the first time I went, I showed up at the Emerald Center, which used to be the Jewish center there on Oregon Pike. I showed up at 6:30 in the dark. I walked nervously up to the door, probably like some people come to church the first time. I rang the door buzzer and waited. Somebody showed up and they said, "Are you one of us?" And I assumed they meant, are you broken like we are? Do you tremor like we are? Do your muscles stiffen like ours do? And I said, yes. And I was welcomed in. Immediately, I was greeted with, will you be on our team this morning? And then when I left 90 minutes later, someone yelled at me, will we see you next week? I thought a lot after that about these questions in the church. And I wondered what would happen if to every stranger who showed up, we asked the same three questions. Are you one of us? Not, are you as good as us? Do you smell as nice as we do? Are you as dressed up as we are? Are you covering up your true self as we're covering up ourselves? But rather, what if we said, are you broken like we're broken? Are you tremoring with anxiety like we're tremoring? Do you still feel shame the way we still feel shame? Do you have doubts about God in the way we have doubts about God? Do you struggle with yourself and to accept yourself like we struggle? Are you sick and in need of healing like we're sick and in need of healing? And if the answer is yes to these questions, get in here because you're one of us. And then what if as they joined us in that morning, we asked them, will you be on our team? And told them what it meant to be on our team. And gave them space to learn what it meant to be on our team. And then what if when they left, we asked expectantly, will we see you next week? When I got home from that first visit to Rocksteady Boxing, I told Heidi I can't go back. I said it was a wonderful experience, but I can't go back because what I see are people who are 5 years ahead of me and 10 years ahead of me and 15 years ahead of me in this diagnosis. And I don't like what I saw, and I'm not sure I'm emotionally ready. And Heidi, in her wisdom, said, I think you need to reconsider. And so I did. And that community has become for me, we've not been meeting for the last year, but we'll start again soon. That community has been unlike any community I've experienced, including the church, where I am accepted just as I am, where I'm part of a team each morning of others who are just as they are. We rarely talk about our disease. Instead, we talk about our lives, our grandchildren, our vacations, our work, our disappointments, our pain, discouragement. We have breakfast together. And that experience at Rocksteady Boxing helped me in my second year to normalize and come to grips with the grief I'd experienced in the first year. Because I found people who were living life, living full lives with their disabilities, but living lives in which they simply made adjustments to live life the way they needed to live it. And what I found as I have made adjustments in my own schedule over the past year in life is that I am enjoying the life I live now much more so than the life I lived before. My life is more settled. I'm more comfortable with myself. I'm less fatigued. And over the last year, I've had a lot more space for creativity because I've been in so fewer committee meetings than I ever was before. Where are we at in terms of what you're thinking about time, Kate?
I think time is just fine at the moment. Larry, do you have a thought?
I'm wondering if Conrad, you're at a point where you wouldn't mind taking a few questions if people have them.
I'd be happy to.
And then make sure that we leave time because we will want to break into smaller groups for that kind of discussion. But I know Conrad always appreciates hearing from the larger group setting. And so if you have something that you've been thinking, you can either put it in the chat and it will go to Kate and Conrad, or you can ask it out. Just remember to turn your microphone on when you speak and then turn it off when you're done.
Yeah, that would be fine. Why don't we do that and see where it goes?
Conrad, one of the things that I was wondering as I heard your sharing is you talked a lot about sort of the differences in between how, as you shared, you were being heard both in the congregation which you serve and in the classroom. You gave a bit of a background as to maybe some of the whys for that, this generation of folks who've grown up since 9/11 particularly. And I'm wondering if you can maybe elaborate on what might be at work in the congregational setting that holds people back from walking with you in ways that are the most helpful in your current journey.
And I want to be really sensitive to how I answer that question because we are very grateful for the support and care we've received. But I think it is difficult for congregations to accept that those who are called to lead them struggle and face challenges. And I think, though, until we are open about that, there's not much chance that we can create space where others can do that. But even then, I think it's very, very difficult. You know, Henry Nouwen talks about this balance perhaps between sharing as a leader in such a way that you are asking for help from the congregation or you're asking for therapy from them versus opening up and being broken so there's a space for brokenness. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I'm going to answer it generally, not specifically about our congregation, but I'll come back to this. My students know they are lost. My students, I don't mean lost going to hell. Hell's not even on their radar. I mean, they know they're disoriented. They know they're confused. They talk about that. They cannot, for the life of them, identify a community that they are part of. I mean, when we talk about it, and I'm not being critical of them, it's the world they've grown up in. For some of them, it's an athletic team. For some of them, it's a family, might be a family. For some of them, it might be a group of friends. But the sheer fractured world in which they have grown up, and I say that with no judgment about the world, it's just part of their reality, is they know that they're not sure where they're going. And I think as a church, we assume that if we acknowledge that we don't know where we're going, somehow we're no longer being faithful, we're no longer Christians, someone told me this, Larry, I'll tell you what, recently, someone said to me, through tears, someone 70 years old who has struggled with shame all their life said, when I became a Christian, the night I walked up and was converted, I went home and told my dad, and he said, okay, now you really have to be good. That's the church. We really have to be good. And if that's the message we hear, the last thing we're going to own is our own brokenness, or probably the brokenness of those who lead us. But my students, what has happened in the classroom is that I'm more closely connected to my students these days than ever. I talked very openly with them about Parkinson's, and it has humanized me. It has made me no longer Dr. Kanagy, but now someone who tremors on the outside like they tremor on the inside. And it has created a connection with them that I think is very difficult for the church. Todd Friesen had a comment. Todd, go ahead.
Conrad, I just want to say how deeply moved I've been by your vulnerability with us. I almost didn't come this morning, and I thank God that I did.
Thanks, Todd.
And this has been one of the most real hours I've had in a while.
Thank you, Todd.
And I just want to name that.
Thank you.
I'm so struck in the Easter stories that we're in right now, how Jesus connects with the disciples in their extreme brokenness and doubt. It's mentioned again and again and again. And, they're not the disciples aren't tapping their watches and asking when Jesus is going to show up. They're terrified.
Yeah.
And I would just love, maybe you're going to go there, but to just get at that core message of Jesus that you're trying to communicate these days in its essence. At some point in the coming hour, I would love to just hear what has that been distilled to for you?
You all right if I address that now? Thank you. Thanks, Todd. And again, I would simply say I received this year as a gift. Someone asked me yesterday in an interview, what is justice? And I said, I think justice is looking at every individual with the human dignity that Jesus looked at them with. Jesus looked at every individual as a human being with and I like to say it this way, rather than saying the image of God, I say the imprint of God, that every human being has the imprint of God upon them. And justice is acknowledging that, naming that for them when they can't see it. And that's what I try to do in my classroom all the time. I will say this way. This is the way I talk to my students about Jesus. I say to them, this is my theological position and my belief. You may not have the same one. I'm not putting this on you, but I want you to know that I believe you've been created with the imprint of God on you, and that your life is sacred. Yeah. And part of my responsibility is to name that and call that out of you. And so for me, Jesus looks at every individual, whether it's Zacchaeus, whether it's the woman at the well. One of the passages that the passage my mother gave me when I was diagnosed was John 9, that powerful story where Jesus heals the blind man and says, nobody sinned, because that's our first question all the time. Who sinned here? And it hasn't changed in 2,000 years. He said, nobody sinned. It's so the work of God can be revealed. And what I've realized over the last year is the work of God that's being revealed in my life is not a healing from PD. People say, oh, we're going to pray to be healed from PD. Well, bless their hearts, that's fine. But in some ways, Todd, I never want to go back. I would not give up the life I have now for the life I had 4 years ago. So for me, Jesus brought justice by seeing every human being as having the imprint of God upon them. But what's amazing is that's also mercy. That's also grace. Grace means that we see every individual with the imprint of God upon them. The podcast I wrote this morning and did as a blog, and it'll come out later today as a podcast, is this, this message we've grown up with, that grace is unmerited favor. Well, I said, that's like saying to my grandson Ezra on his second birthday, Ezra, you're really a scumbag. You're really a bum. I just want you to know that up front. You're a bum. You don't deserve what I'm going to give to you. But because I'm so good, because I'm so gracious, because I'm such a good grandpa, I'm gonna give you this anyway. Todd, that's what I heard growing up. Yeah. That I don't deserve it. I'm bad, but God is so good, he's going to give it. When I read the Gospels, when I read the story, and I say this morning in the podcast, Jesus' story about the father or mother who gives their child whatever they ask for and says, if you can do that, how much more so the Father? Well, where's that message been, Todd? Why has that message of Jesus, of this extravagant, overflowing gift that God doesn't give us begrudgingly, but is just waiting to give to us? Where's that been? And then you can go to the story of the prodigal, and it's the same deal. Yeah. There's no shame when that prodigal returns. There is only love. There is only grace. The Father doesn't say, you don't deserve this banquet, but because I'm such a good father, I'm going to give it to you. Like, that's not good news. Good news is you've come back to life. Good news is you were gone and now you're home. So that's the message of Jesus. And what I think is that mercy and justice come together in Jesus in that way, by seeing in every person the imprint of God and treating every individual with dignity. I don't know. That's part of the answer that I'm working at.
Thank you so much, Conrad.
Yeah.
Conrad, we have a question in the chat about the 3 sentences that were said to you when you entered Rocksteady Boxing, and the person commenting said, this is powerful for the church to hear and practice. So would you mind repeating those?
Sure, I'd love to. Are you one of us? Will you join our team? And will we see you next week? And I began using that language in our congregation, and it caught on. And people began to say, you're one of us. You're one of us. And I mean, it's in some ways AA language, I'm Conrad and I'm broken. Yesterday or the day before, in a podcast that got more attention than any I've done probably, I talk about, that I'm part of the RTA, Revival Tent Anonymous folks, who are recovering from George Bronk. I pick on George Bronk, but those were traumatic moments for me. And so I think that yes, I think it's a powerful message if the church can adapt it. And I don't have the answers for how people, do I believe in discipleship? Absolutely. But was I being discipled at Rocksteady Boxing? Absolutely. I jumped in and joined the team. I gained balance, I gained strength by joining the team. And nobody looked at me and said, you're not making enough progress. You're not doing it well enough. We were all at different places and we accepted each other in the places we were at. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have another question, I think, from someone. Feel free to unmute yourself and just speak, or if you prefer to chat the question.
Hi, Conrad, it's Ann Kaufman-Weaver, and I echo Todd Friesen's just deep appreciation for your vulnerability and wisdom that you're sharing. This is a risk, and I hear you saying it's a risk well worth taking. I have a question for you about anxiety. You mentioned what I would agree with, that our society has been facing an increase in anxiety over the last number of decades. You related it to modernism, and I agree with that as well. I'm just wondering what you're finding as, how do we lessen anxiety? How do we, we're in that phase of polarization. And so, and you're sensing it, you're experiencing every time you talk, you're hearing from people who agree or don't agree. But do you have any wisdom about what is actually lowering anxiety, or what could lower anxiety in our society?
And I'm not sure that I can answer that better than you answered it when you and Todd came to our church and gave that presentation that you did on grief. And I think was so helpful in us accepting where we're at in our lives and what we're experiencing. And I don't have the answer, because I mean, beyond, I just thought you did a masterful job, and I welcome your sharing your thoughts on that. I just say one thing: the sociological imagination is a concept that I often talk about with my students, and it's the idea that the macro level always impacts the micro level. That we as individuals are always products of, we're being produced by the larger society. And so we blame each other. We blame one another for our failures or take credit for our successes. But in so many ways, it depends on which cultural map we're dropped into, and the privilege and opportunity we have, and the macro level experiences that we have. And so there is something, Anne, taking place at the macro level of the world in which our students are growing up that I have to say is part, I mean, you cannot look at what happened on January 6th and not recognize the principalities and powers that we are dealing with these days that have so co-opted the message of Jesus and the church, which I think we have so turned into everything else to deal with our anxiety, except to the one who offers hope for our anxiety and who came to be with us in our anxiety. And I'm not trying to over spiritualize this. I just think it's true. I think that's why Jesus came to be with us. And so it's in that, and you would have emphasized this on that Sunday as well, but it's in the being with one another. It's in being present to one another and vulnerable and open with one another that I think is probably the key to doing that, at least part of the key. But I'd welcome your response, because it's a great question.
Well, I was really hoping you'd have an answer, because that's
Remember,
what we all want. I know. I tried to get an answer. Well, I just maybe naming the title of the sermon and allow others to think about this too. But I named that sermon "Living, Losing, Resurrecting," and it was from a poem, Richard somebody, about a butterfly and just the phases that a butterfly goes through. You know, caterpillar is living, and then it goes into the cocoon, loses itself, and then resurrects. And so there is that process that I think individuals go through and groups go through and the church is going through. And I just am searching for ways to reduce anxiety within people and groups and churches and societies, because we just behave so poorly when we're anxious. And so I don't have the wisdom. I'm looking for that from others.
But you did bring a very comforting presence and a way of approaching what I would say is an anxious congregation with what you and Todd did, and the mix of music. It was very well done.
Thank you.
Yeah. Todd, I saw your question at the end. When we get towards the end, I do have the links to the podcast and the other resources for you. So I'm kind of counting on you, Kate, to keep help me stay on track here. So I'm really open to this flowing the way it's flowing, but I'm also want to be sensitive to what you're thinking about in terms of time and schedule.
Are there any more questions at this point? We can also come back after the breakout groups too and address more questions if that would be helpful as well. I think, Conrad, we'll turn it back to you and
Okay.
you can move us forward.
Wrap up, and then I have a few comments and then move us into a breakout session. A month or two ago, the New Yorker had a really, had an essay entitled The Last Children of Down Syndrome. And it was a disconcerting and disturbing story, no matter your view of fetal genetic testing, no matter what side you take on the question of abortion or disabilities or whatever. And it presented the country of Denmark as Exhibit A in how society can eliminate Down syndrome from a population by eliminating the fetus before it shows up. And the author wasn't making a judgment statement, but was really asking a provocative, and I thought, as someone with a disability, an interesting question. The author leaves us with the thought that perhaps one day we will not see an extra chromosome as an anomaly. And I was struck by that thought, that there may be, what if there would be a day where we did not see an extra chromosome as an anomaly, but rather stretch ourselves to redefine and consider the spectrum of what it means to be a human being. And I think, because if we become a society that is out to eliminate all of our brokenness, or all of our crookedness, or all of, and I'm not making a judgment here, I'm raising a question. Because there will be a day, undoubtedly, when parents will have the choice to decide, if it looks like the kid's going to get PD, what are they going to do with them? Or something else. And I've heard the message, including from someone who has Parkinson's, who said to me, do not allow Parkinson's disease to define who you are. And the sociologist in me has said that I can't do that. It's like telling someone who has a disability not to be defined by the disability. Sounds to me like, don't be who you are. Like, I can't hide this. I can't, how can I not allow this to define some part of who I am? We don't tell our children not to allow their successes to define them. Instead, we pour time and energy and resources into making sure that their successes do define them. So I think the risk we have as a culture, which I think in my students and has increased their anxiety, and they talk about this, the emphasis on them to be successful is so, so high. They have become projects of their parents now. Parents who pour energy, time, money into their success. And they feel tremendous, and they talk about it, tremendous pressure to achieve. And that creates anxiety for them. And it's my concern that we are part of a society that is increasingly, as David Brooks notes, defining ourselves by our resume virtues rather than our eulogy virtues. Defining ourselves by what's on paper rather than what's in the heart. And that creates anxiety. And for me, that I think has finally, as much as possible at this point in life, been broken. And what I care more about these days is what's inside of me and what's going to be remembered at the end of this horizon, rather than than what's on my resume. And so I think that's part of the challenge, and that the church faces if we. David Brubaker responded to my podcast this week. So I have a private Facebook group that anyone's invited into. I started 3 months ago, and it's almost 800 members now. And it's the place where I say it's a learning lab where we dive deeper into the issues that I'm addressing in the podcast. And so every Monday and Thursday at 3:45, I do a live interview with someone. I've had all kinds of guests from all across the spectrum. Some who are of Christian faith, some who are not. But it's looking at what is God up to in this excavation project. And David Brubaker responded to me. He said, Michael Sattler said that Christ hated the world and we were also called to hate the world. And he said, until we break this purity narrative, we're never going to get on with the mission God's called us to. And so this idea that don't let Parkinson's define me, I resist, because for me, it's part of that perfection narrative. It's part of that purity narrative. It's like, no, Parkinson's for me has been one of the best things, frankly, that's ever happened to me. And I know I've got years ahead of me that are going to be hard. And I know I don't know what's ahead of me, but I do know that the God who's gotten me this far will continue to walk with me. That I have no doubt about. And so I think my experience of understanding in new ways that brokenness brings transformation. It goes back to Todd, what you said, and also to Ian, what you said, that I think is so important. I think I'm going to break. I have a couple of questions for you. I'm going to share the screen and just ask you to break into your groups here in a moment. And I don't know, you can tell me then how long, Kate, they should be in. Let me see, this is not, for some reason the screen is not moving now. Oh yeah, here it is. This was the John 9 word that I talked about. And I love how Jesus comes to this man once he gets kicked out. This guy stood up to the church and the church kicked him out, and Jesus comes and finds him. And I think that's what Jesus does. He comes and always comes and finds us. I'll come back to the resources, but the questions for the breakout are this. How has the dismantling of the church impacted your life and ministry? And in what ways has the presentation contributed to any new understanding, if any, or insight about the church and about your life? So Kate, those would be the two questions that I would have. And I would say, if we break out for whatever time you think, and then come back for responses to what people heard in their group, I would love to hear that.
I think if we give folks about 10 minutes, that would give you each about 2 minutes to talk in your group. I think, Conrad, are you able to chat those questions so folks can see them as they move into the breakout groups?
Yes, sorry.
Thank you.
I'll do that.
No. So we'll send you into breakout groups, and then if you, we'll get a countdown to come back to the group, and then we'll be glad to hear what you have to share from your group. So we'll do that now. Any thoughts from your groups?
I think in our group, we all expressed appreciation, Conrad, for your transparency and sharing how God's been working in your life and the value of sharing your story and how that gives freedom to other people to share their story and also get out of the captivity that we think is a safe place. It really isn't at all. And we get to be able to draw out the best in others. When you answered Todd's question about the story of Jesus that you're telling, that's what he wants to do, draw out our story and give us freedom to live who he created us to be. So that was just very refreshing and helpful for me.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you very much.
I want to say thank you, Conrad, for your presentation this morning. And as you know, I've been following your blog and enjoying that as well. I feel like we are right on the edge of something happening. And it's, to me, this dismantling, while at times it just puts me over the top, there's also something happening that is really good. and powerful and positive. And the coronavirus, we're not back to church yet, but I'm just struck by how something has happened. We're not who we were, and to come back differently. And how do we talk about that? And how do we look at that? And I think it's a good thing. In the midst of this, I preached about the 3 angst and this year, and it's coronavirus. Yes, it's racism, and it's a new awareness of racism, I should say. And it's the political stuff that is all stuff that divides us, but is also, there's just an undercurrent of, I don't even know how to name it, that growth can happen out of that. And so I see a lot of positives in the midst of what is just really hard to be a pastor in the midst of.
Thank you, Dawn. I think in part, I started this private group because I just needed a community of people who were feeling and experiencing some of the same things. And it's so clear that it's resonated, and it's almost, and I don't want to use categories, but I don't know how else to say it. The language of piety and about Jesus, and I mean piety in the very best way. I mean, not piety as in masking, but that I'm hearing from folks who would probably define themselves as progressive is amazing to me. I mean, it's like a lid has come off as they respond to some of this stuff. And I think I go back to myself. I think I've been ashamed sometimes to talk about Jesus more because I was ashamed of myself and than anything else. And so I think to get back to a place where what is happening is just this identifying of Jesus of the Gospels that you just mentioned, all of these, we've been so far from that. So Dawn, I would love to see that breaking loose. And I'm with you. I think there is a kind of, there's something stirring.
Just a quick other thing. One thing that was really helpful for me, I did a silent retreat and I looked at the book of Luke. I was getting nailed by some people, and just, and looked at how Jesus handled people who were coming at him. How did he handle the scribe and Pharisees? And he addressed them and he said, but this is who I am. This is who I am. And just kept coming back to. And for me, that's been the challenge, to say, who am I and what is my ministry in Jesus, and to stay focused there.
Yeah. Amen. This is my story. This is my song. And I've said, if you don't like it, go sing your own story, sing your own song, or listen to somebody else's, but I'm not going to change my story and my song. And I don't mean that arrogantly. This is just who I am. So I thank you.
So Conrad, this is Robert. As you were talking about your students and a lot of thoughts about being pastors and raising teenagers in the church, and hearing some of the questions that they're raising. And some of these same things you talked about, the anxiety that they're growing up in, the things of justice, racial injustice, environmental, gender issues, those types of things. And how do we, and you talked to this a little bit, but do you have any advice on how we walk with them?
I want to be really cautious and humble in my response, but I would say for the last 10 years, the congregation has heard, I've been a one sermon preacher, and that has been, if we develop a life with God, we can talk about any of this stuff. If we come to the table, having spent, as Dawn talked about, your retreat, if we have practiced the disciplines and have developed a deep life with God, then we can see our way through this stuff. Our kids will see their way through it. And so for me, that is just, I often say to the congregation, if you do not practice a life with God, there's only so much hiding I can do when you run into trouble. Because somewhere within you, you must draw upon who God is in your life and your experience. And so I think it's in some ways it sounds simple, but you and I all know that practicing a regular disciplined life with God takes discipline. But it's what has seen me through. Heidi and I were separated for 2.5 years. That was a turning to God that I did. It was early in our marriage. 2 bouts with cancer. She had ovarian cancer. Now PD. Every one of those have deepened my life with God. And had I not turned towards God or away, I've always said in those moments, those are the moments to gain traction with God, in our life with God. And that's what I've said to the church. This is the moment to gain traction in our life with God. And so, Robert, I think if we practice a life with God, and I don't know what else to say. I think it's the only answer. If we look at the issues as the primary thing, we'll never be beyond them. They're always going to be. Every generation's dealing with them. My grandfather Erie became more and more. Several years ago, I just began to pray that I'd have the same sense of God's love for him that he had growing up as a pastor. And I podcasted about him yesterday or the day before, but just increasingly soft, kind. He always had been. But yeah, his life with God just became richer and richer. And the more that life became richer, I mean, he went to the Belleville restaurant, which was sold alcohol at some point, and he just hung out with people. He was in all the places he shouldn't have been. And I think when we receive the love of God, we receive the love for others. Yeah, so I think it's life with God.
Conrad, you made the statement about rock steady boxing. We do not talk about the disease, we talk about our lives. That was just very powerful. Do you have anything else to elaborate on that? In some ways it says a lot, but I'd be curious if there's some things I'm not hearing that you have to offer with that.
We talk about the disease in terms of, has there been some progression? Or one of the things that's most useful is we're all going through the same thing. And so someone finds out something from Michael J. Fox's website and they tell the rest of us, or their physician tells them something about nutrition and they tell the rest of us. But there is no moaning and groaning. I mean, there is no sitting around feeling sorry for anybody at all. I've never experienced it. And we end it with gathering in a group and with a big cheer at the end, rock steady boxing. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I took my students there and they were amazed at the experience that we have together. And it's, I'm not sure how to answer your question, Gary, except that there is less complaint. There is so much less complaining there than in church. I mean, it just is. I mean, they are full of joy. And I know it sounds like I'm beating up on the church, but we got a lot to learn in the church. Or as followers of Jesus, whatever.
Well, I just appreciate you saying there's not complaining, because that's what gets us in trouble. We're not even focusing on what matters. We're focusing on the negative and the stuff that keeps pulling us down, and we don't even realize that by complaining we're getting deeper.
That's exactly right.
Thank you all so much. Conrad, do you have some words to wrap us up, or Larry, anything that you want to add as we end? I appreciate so much what you've brought to us today, Conrad. It's been really a wonderful experience. Thank you.
I would just take 2 seconds to thank all of you for taking time for participating today. We see this as a part of our mission in terms of not only walking with folks who are aging themselves, but providing resources. And Conrad's story of walking with Parkinson's is lived out in many ways by folks in your congregations. And if we can be a part of walking with you and servicing those in your areas, please let us know. We're grateful for the partnership with Parish Resource Center. That has been a great way for us to get the word out about resources like Conrad's. And just very grateful that you've taken the time to do this. And we anticipate that even when we do things in the future in person, we will have this component. So those of you who may not be within easy driving distance are able to participate. So thank you very much, both to you, Kate, you and your team, and certainly to Conrad. And Conrad, feel free to finish up what you have for us.
Okay. I will just share the resources that I promised I would offer you. They'll be in the link. So there are several things that have developed out of this. And so one is the podcast, which has almost become a daily podcast. It's also a blog. So you can go to my website, which is www.churchdismantled.com, to see updates, but also to subscribe to the blog that comes out. Usually I write these early in the morning, and then I'll do the podcast right after that or a little bit later in the day. And the podcast comes out. You can see it there. There are two links. It's on Apple Podcasts, but there's also a website, a Buzzsprout website. But it's on any podcast carrier at this point. And then the Facebook group is where we have the ongoing conversations. So I know not everyone's, I know there are all kinds of issues with Facebook, but this is a private group. People need to request to come in, or I need to invite them. If you're interested, you need to friend request my personal page, and then I can bring you in. It's the only way to bring people in. You can also invite other people in, though. And so I've got folks inviting people in. And we've had some detractors, but there's usually, they self-select out at some point. And it's where I announce the events that are coming up. And then it's also where I post the events. But then I also have a YouTube channel where these live at 3:45 events are listed. I've had Cesar Garcia from NI World Conference. I've just had a whole list. Kevin Ressler from the United Way, speaking about the complicity of the church in racism. And a lot of people are watching these. So that's where you can go. Also, I'm really blessed. I found an editor, and it was someday I'll tell this story too, but I have a wonderful editor who's putting together about 50 of these episodes that were at the front end, and then we're working on a second one that would come out later this year. And my goal is to make this cheap, and so I found a publisher who's going to get them out quickly, inexpensively, as both softback, paperback, but also an ebook. And so at this point in my life, my goal is just making this stuff available to people. And so you will see, I'll announce those on the website when they're coming out. At the end of July, the first one should come out, the second one by the end of the year. And then I have a sabbatical this fall from the college to begin a new podcast called Growing Old at Midlife, Aging, Spirituality, and Regeneration. I created a course with Tam Humbert, who Dr. Humbert is a chair of occupational therapy here at the college. We've run this course. This will be an extension of the course, and it's going to include lots of interviews, folks who are experiencing aging, chronic illness, but also experts in the field. And sponsors, I'm happy to say, Atlantis Communities, Stewardship Advisors, and if others are interested in sponsoring this particular podcast, I'm open to that. So that's coming later this year. So that's what I have. And I just thank you for being here. Thank you, Kate, for inviting me, Larry for inviting me. I'm honored to be here, and for all of you who shared your story, thank you for being part of this.
Thank you, Conrad. Thank you to Landis Communities and to Larry for this event as well. And like I said, we will be sending out the video along with Conrad's PowerPoint, and so you can easily connect to those resources as well early next week. Thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Kate.